The crisis leader Paul Hogan's humanitarian mission during the East Timor emergency. In the politically turbulent year of 1999, 35-year-old Paul Hogan faced the greatest challenge of his humanitarian career when violent conflict erupted in East Timor following its independence referendum, creating a refugee crisis that would test every principle he had developed about authentic leadership, cultural bridge building, and service to others, while demanding immediate action to save lives and preserve hope in one of the darkest moments in Southeast Asian history. The crisis began when Paul received an urgent call from Dr. Amara Okafor at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, requesting his immediate assistance in coordinating international humanitarian response to the systematic violence and displacement that had forced over 200,000 East Timorese civilians to flee their homes, while Indonesian-backed militias destroyed infrastructure and terrorized communities in retaliation for voting for independence from Indonesian occupation. Paul's decision to leave his comfortable life in Australia and enter one of the world's most dangerous humanitarian emergencies was motivated not by any desire for adventure or recognition, but by his deep conviction that authentic leadership meant serving others in their greatest moments of need, regardless of personal cost or risk to safety, reputation, or career that might result from involvement in politically sensitive situations. The journey to Darwin, where displaced East Timorese were arriving by boat in desperate condition after fleeing violence that had destroyed their communities and separated families, provided Paul with his first direct experience of large-scale human suffering that transcended anything he had previously encountered in his community development and cultural bridge-building work in Australia and other stable societies. Standing on the dock as overcrowded fishing boats arrived carrying traumatized families who had lost everything except their lives, Paul confronted the reality that authentic humanitarian leadership required not just good intentions and relationship-building skills, but the courage to make life-and-death decisions under pressure while coordinating complex operations involving multiple governments, international organizations, and aid agencies whose different priorities and procedures could either save lives or create deadly delays. The refugee camp that rapidly emerged on the outskirts of Darwin became Paul's classroom in crisis leadership as he learned to balance urgent survival needs with respect for cultural dignity and community structure that remained essential for maintaining hope and social cohesion among people whose entire world had been destroyed, but who still possessed knowledge, skills, and wisdom that could contribute to their own recovery and eventual return home. Paul's authentic approach to humanitarian leadership would be tested through challenges that required him to navigate international politics, coordinate complex logistics, manage competing organizational priorities, and maintain focus on human dignity while making decisions that could determine whether families lived or died, communities survived or disintegrated, and hope or despair shaped the future of an entire nation struggling to be born. Chapter 1. The Emergency Call. Paul Hogan's transformation from cultural bridge builder to crisis humanitarian leader began with Dr. Amara Okafor's desperate phone call at 3 a.m. on September 8, 1999, as reports of systematic violence and mass displacement in East Timor reached international agencies whose resources and expertise would be insufficient to address the scale of human suffering without extraordinary coordination and leadership from individuals who possessed both humanitarian experience and cultural understanding. Paul, we need someone who can work with traumatized communities while coordinating international response efforts, Dr. Okafor explained during their emergency conversation. The violence is escalating beyond anything we anticipated, and traditional refugee response protocols are inadequate for the cultural and political complexities we're facing. We need someone who understands that humanitarian work is about relationships and dignity, not just logistics and supplies. The request forced Paul to confront the difference between his previous community development work in stable environments and the life-or-death urgency of humanitarian crisis response, where decisions made in minutes could affect thousands of lives, while political considerations and resource limitations created constraints that could prevent effective assistance despite the desperate need and available goodwill from international supporters. Paul's immediate response was to accept the mission without hesitation, despite having no direct experience with violent conflict or large-scale refugee operations, because his commitment to authentic service meant responding to genuine need regardless of personal comfort or professional qualifications that might be considered prerequisites for such complex and dangerous humanitarian leadership responsibilities. The briefing materials that Paul studied during his flight to Darwin revealed the complexity of East Timor's situation, where centuries of Portuguese colonization had been followed by decades of Indonesian occupation that had suppressed East Timorese culture and independence aspirations while creating political and military tensions that exploded into violence when the population voted overwhelmingly for independence in a UN-supervised referendum. The cultural information provided by UN specialists emphasized the importance of understanding East Timorese social structures, religious practices, and community leadership patterns that would be essential for organizing effective refugee assistance while maintaining dignity and hope among people whose trauma included not just physical displacement, but cultural and spiritual disruption that threatened their identity and cohesion as a people. Paul's first sight of Darwin's rapidly expanding refugee reception facilities provided immediate evidence of both the scale of human need and the inadequacy of standard humanitarian response procedures for addressing the complex requirements of traumatized communities whose survival depended not just on food, shelter, and medical care, but on maintaining cultural identity and community structure that provided meaning and hope during their darkest hours. The initial coordination meeting with representatives from the Australian government, UN agencies, and international aid organizations revealed the challenges of managing humanitarian response involving multiple bureaucracies with different priorities, procedures, and political constraints that could either facilitate or obstruct effective assistance depending on how well coordination and communication were managed between competing institutional interests. Paul's role was officially defined as Community Liaison Coordinator, but the reality was that he would need to serve as cultural interpreter, logistics coordinator, diplomatic mediator, and psychological counselor while helping traumatized refugees navigate unfamiliar systems designed by people who had never experienced displacement or cultural disruption that destroyed not just physical security, but spiritual and social foundations of identity and belonging. The first group of refugees that Paul encountered included families who had been separated during their escape, elderly people whose medications and medical records had been lost, children who had witnessed violence that no child should experience, and community leaders who felt responsible for people they had been unable to protect from forces beyond their control or understanding. Maria Soares, a former teacher from Dili who had arrived with her 3 young children, but without her husband who had been killed defending their village, became Paul's first direct teacher about the intersection of individual trauma and community responsibility that characterized East Timorese culture and required humanitarian approaches that addressed both personal and collective needs simultaneously. "We are not just individuals seeking safety," Maria explained through tears during their first conversation. "We are a people trying to survive as a people. If we lose our culture and community, we have lost everything, even if we save our lives. Can you help us remain East Timorese while we are away from East Timor?" Paul's commitment to Maria and hundreds of other refugees required him to develop rapid expertise in trauma counseling, cultural preservation, international law, and crisis logistics, while maintaining the authentic relationships and cultural sensitivity that had made his previous community work effective in less urgent but equally complex human situations involving dignity, identity, and hope. The refugee camp's daily operations provided Paul with intensive education in humanitarian leadership under conditions where every decision had immediate consequences for human welfare, while political pressures and resource constraints created competing priorities that required constant negotiation and compromise without losing focus on the fundamental human needs and cultural values that made survival meaningful rather than just biological. The establishment of community leadership structures within the refugee camp required Paul to balance democratic participation with urgent decision-making needs while respecting traditional authority patterns that provided stability and identity for displaced people whose entire social world had been disrupted, but who still needed familiar cultural frameworks for organizing their daily lives and maintaining hope for eventual return home. Chapter 2: Building Hope from Despair. The development of comprehensive refugee support systems required Paul to coordinate between Australian government agencies, UN organizations, and international aid groups while maintaining focus on the authentic human needs of East Timorese families whose survival depended not just on basic necessities, but on maintaining cultural identity and community cohesion that provided meaning and hope during their displacement from the homeland they had voted to liberate. The complexity of refugee needs became apparent as Paul worked with families whose trauma extended beyond physical displacement to include cultural and spiritual disruption that threatened their identity as a people, requiring humanitarian approaches that addressed individual psychological needs while preserving community structures and cultural practices that provided resilience and hope during their darkest hours. Dr. Rosa Martinez, a specialist in refugee trauma who arrived from Geneva to assist with psychological support services, helped Paul understand how cultural identity and community relationships served as crucial resources for healing that could be either strengthened or undermined by humanitarian intervention, depending on whether aid programs respected indigenous knowledge and social structures or imposed external solutions that increased dependency and cultural disruption. The most important thing we can do is help people maintain their sense of who they are while providing safety and support, Dr. Martinez explained during their planning sessions. Paul's approach of building authentic relationships while respecting cultural knowledge creates healing environments that enable communities to draw on their own strengths rather than becoming dependent on external assistance that undermine their capacity for self-determination and eventual return home. The establishment of cultural preservation programs within the refugee camp included language schools for children, traditional craft workshops for adults, and community meetings conducted in Tetum that enabled East Timorese leaders to maintain their authority and decision-making processes while adapting to temporary displacement conditions that required flexibility without compromising essential cultural values and practices. The success of cultural preservation efforts attracted attention from international media and aid organizations whose previous approaches to refugee assistance had focused primarily on basic survival needs without recognizing the importance of cultural identity and community structure for psychological healing and long-term recovery that enabled displaced populations to maintain hope and resilience during extended periods of uncertainty. Paul's coordination with Indonesian and East Timorese community leaders in Australia created opportunities for dialogue and reconciliation that transcended the political conflicts underlying the crisis while building relationships based on shared concern for human welfare and cultural understanding that could contribute to eventual peace and stability in East Timor. The development of economic activities within the refugee camp provided displaced families with opportunities to maintain dignity and contribute to community welfare through traditional skills and knowledge that generated income while preserving cultural practices and social relationships that were essential for psychological healing and preparation for eventual return to reconstructed communities in East Timor. The success of refugee-operated small businesses and craft cooperatives demonstrated how humanitarian assistance could strengthen rather than undermine cultural capacity and community self-reliance when programs were designed to utilize existing knowledge and skills rather than creating dependency on external resources and decision-making that diminished refugees' sense of agency and hope for eventual independence. Paul's role evolved from coordinator to facilitator as East Timorese leaders assumed increasing responsibility for camp management, community organization, while receiving support for addressing challenges that required external resources or coordination with Australian government agencies and international organizations whose assistance was essential but needed to be delivered in ways that respected refugee dignity and cultural autonomy. The educational programs developed for refugee children balance preparation for potential long-term residence in Australia with maintenance of East Timorese cultural identity and knowledge that would be essential for eventual return home, creating learning environments that honored both practical needs and cultural values while preparing young people for uncertain futures that might require bicultural competencies. The healthcare programs that combined Western medicine with traditional East Timorese healing practices provided more effective treatment for trauma and physical ailments while respecting cultural beliefs and practices that were central to refugees' identity and sense of spiritual well-being that conventional medical approaches often ignored or actively undermined through cultural insensitivity and institutional arrogance. The success of integrated healthcare approaches attracted attention from medical schools and international health organizations seeking more effective methods for providing culturally responsive care to refugee populations whose healing required attention to spiritual and cultural needs, as well as physical symptoms and psychological trauma that were interconnected aspects of holistic human well-being. The documentation of refugee experiences and cultural knowledge created valuable archives that preserved East Timorese history and traditions while providing resources for eventual reconstruction and cultural revitalization efforts that would be essential for building stable and prosperous communities in an independent East Timor that honored both traditional values and contemporary needs. Paul's coordination with international human rights organizations created platforms for East Timorese voices to be heard in global forums where their experiences and perspectives informed policy discussions about humanitarian intervention, refugee protection, and post-conflict reconstruction that would affect their future while ensuring that their knowledge and preferences influenced decisions about their own lives and communities. The development of communication systems that connected refugees with family members who remained in East Timor or had fled to other countries provided emotional support that was essential for maintaining hope in family relationships while also gathering information about conditions in East Timor that informed planning for eventual return and reconstruction efforts. Chapter 3, The International Response. Paul's expanding role in coordinating international humanitarian response required him to navigate complex relationships between competing organizations, governments, and political interests while maintaining focus on East Timorese needs and priorities that sometimes conflicted with institutional procedures and political considerations that prioritized organizational efficiency over cultural sensitivity and community empowerment. The arrival of additional international agencies created both opportunities and challenges for comprehensive refugee support, as different organizations brought valuable resources and expertise while also introducing competing priorities and procedures that could either enhance or complicate service delivery depending on how well coordination and communication were managed between groups with different institutional cultures and operational approaches. The Australian government's political sensitivity about Indonesian relations complicated humanitarian assistance efforts, as diplomatic considerations sometimes conflicted with refugee needs and human rights principles that Paul and other humanitarian workers considered non-negotiable in their commitment to protecting vulnerable populations whose lives and dignity depended on international support and advocacy. Paul's role as intermediary between political authorities and refugee communities required him to translate between different languages and cultural frameworks while advocating for policies and procedures that served humanitarian objectives without creating diplomatic problems that might reduce political support for refugee assistance programs or complicate eventual reconstruction efforts in East Timor. The coordination meetings with government officials provided Paul with education in political complexity that surrounded humanitarian crises, where competing national interests, international law, domestic politics, and media attention created pressures that could either support or undermine effective assistance, depending on how skillfully humanitarian leaders managed relationships with decision-makers who controlled resources and access. Cardinal Justin Ribeiro, the Catholic Archbishop of Darwin, who had extensive experience in East Timor and close relationships with church leaders who were coordinating assistance efforts there, became Paul's crucial ally in understanding both the cultural dimensions of East Timorese society and the political dynamics that were shaping international response to the crisis. The East Timorese people have maintained their faith and culture through centuries of occupation and oppression, Cardinal Ribeiro explained during their first meeting. Our task is not to save them but to support their own efforts to preserve their identity and rebuild their communities. Paul's approach of authentic relationship building is exactly what's needed to provide effective assistance while respecting their dignity and autonomy. The collaboration with Catholic organizations created access to international networks and resources that were essential for scaling refugee assistance programs while maintaining the cultural sensitivity and community empowerment approaches that Paul had developed through his previous bridge-building work with diverse populations in Australia and other stable environments. The establishment of communication systems that connected Darwin's refugee operations with assistance efforts in other countries where East Timorese had fled created opportunities for coordination and resource sharing that improved efficiency while enabling separated families to maintain contact and share information about conditions and opportunities in different locations. The development of resettlement programs for refugees who chose to remain permanently in Australia required Paul to adapt his cultural bridge-building expertise to help East Timorese families integrate into Australia communities while maintaining their cultural identity and connections to the independence struggle that continued in their homeland. The success of resettlement programs attracted attention from government agencies and community organizations in other countries that were receiving East Timorese refugees, leading to requests for Paul to share his approaches and provide training for humanitarian workers who lacked experience with cultural bridge building and community empowerment methods that were proving more effective than traditional refugee services. Paul's testimony before the Australian Parliament's inquiry into the East Timor crisis provided opportunities to influence government policy while educating political leaders about the importance of cultural sensitivity and community empowerment in humanitarian assistance that served both immediate needs and long-term objectives of stability and development in post-conflict societies. The parliamentary testimony also created media attention that increased public awareness and support for East Timorese refugees, while demonstrating how authentic humanitarian leadership could generate political support for policies that served both moral obligations and practical interests in regional stability and international cooperation. The International Conference on East Timor Reconstruction that Paul helped organize brought together government officials, aid organizations, academic experts, and East Timorese leaders to develop comprehensive plans for post-conflict recovery that utilized refugee experiences and cultural knowledge while addressing the massive challenges of rebuilding infrastructure, institutions, and economic systems in a devastated country. The conference demonstrated how humanitarian crisis response could be connected to longer-term development planning that respected local knowledge and priorities while utilizing international resources and expertise, creating frameworks for reconstruction that served both immediate recovery needs and sustainable development objectives that would benefit East Timorese communities for generations. The establishment of the East Timor Reconstruction Foundation provided institutional support for ongoing assistance and development programs that could continue after the immediate crisis ended, while ensuring that East Timorese voices and priorities remained central to decision-making about their own future and the kind of society they wanted to build in their independent homeland. Paul's role in the foundation's development required him to apply his organizational and fundraising skills while maintaining the authentic relationships and cultural understanding that had made his crisis response work effective. demonstrating how emergency humanitarian leadership could evolve into long-term development cooperation that served both immediate needs and historical aspirations for self-determination and prosperity. Chapter 4: The Return Home. The gradual stabilization of conditions in East Timor created opportunities for voluntary repatriation that required Paul to coordinate complex logistics while addressing the emotional and practical challenges facing refugees who had to decide whether to return to a homeland that had been physically and culturally devastated or remain in Australia, where they had established new lives and relationships during their displacement. The repatriation planning process revealed the complexity of individual decisions about return as families weighed their attachment to East Timor against the security and opportunities they had found in Australia, while considering the needs of children who had adapted to Australian schools and culture but whose identity remained connected to East Timorese heritage and community. Maria Soares, whose husband had been killed during the violence but who had established a successful small business in Darwin, faced the difficult choice between remaining in Australia, where her children were thriving in school, or returning to East Timor, where her extended family needed her help in rebuilding their community while honoring her husband's sacrifice for independence. This decision breaks my heart because both choices mean losing something precious, Maria confided to Paul during one of their counseling sessions. If I stay, my children will be safe and successful, but they will lose connection to their father's homeland and the culture he died to protect. If I return, I can help rebuild our community and honor his memory, but I risk my children's future for an uncertain dream. Paul's role in supporting refugees through these decisions required him to balance practical advice with respect for individual choice while providing information and support that enabled people to make informed decisions based on their own values and priorities rather than external pressures or expectations from family members, community leaders, or humanitarian organizations. The development of preparation programs for refugees choosing to return included practical training in post-conflict reconstruction skills, emotional preparation for encountering destroyed communities and changed social relationships, and cultural renewal activities that strengthened identity and connections that would be essential for successful reintegration into East Timorese society. The success of preparation programs demonstrated how humanitarian assistance could serve both immediate needs and long-term objectives by providing refugees with knowledge, skills, and emotional readiness that would enable them to contribute effectively to reconstruction efforts while maintaining the cultural identity and community relationships that were essential for social stability and economic development. Paul's coordination with UN Transitional Administration in East Timor, UNTAF, created systematic procedures for repatriation that respected individual choice while providing logistical support and protection that enabled safe return for refugees who chose to participate in rebuilding their homeland rather than remaining permanently in Australia or other countries where they had found temporary or permanent refuge. The first repatriation flight that Paul accompanied from Darwin to Dili provided him with direct experience of refugees' emotional responses to returning home after witnessing the destruction of their communities and the deaths of family members and friends, while also observing their resilience and determination to rebuild despite the enormous challenges they would face in a devastated country. The reunion scenes at Dili's airport revealed both the joy of homecoming and the trauma of recognizing how much had been lost, as returning refugees embraced surviving family members while confronting the reality that many loved ones were dead and familiar communities had been destroyed by violence that had targeted not just individuals, but cultural institutions and social infrastructure. Paul's work with returning refugees in East Timor required him to adapt his humanitarian leadership skills to post-conflict reconstruction challenges that were different from emergency response, but equally complex in their requirements for cultural sensitivity, community empowerment, and coordination between international assistance and local knowledge and priorities. The establishment of community reconstruction programs that utilized both returned refugees' experiences in Australia and local survivors' knowledge of conditions in East Timor created effective approaches to rebuilding that honored cultural traditions while incorporating innovations and skills that had been learned during displacement experiences in different countries. The success of community-based reconstruction demonstrated how humanitarian crisis response could be connected to sustainable development through programs that built on cultural strengths and social relationships while addressing practical needs for infrastructure, education, healthcare, and economic opportunities that were essential for social stability and individual prosperity. Paul's documentation of repatriation experiences provided valuable information for UN agencies and other organizations working on post-conflict reconstruction in East Timor and similar situations worldwide, contributing to improved understanding of how voluntary return could be supported while respecting refugee choice and utilizing displacement experiences as resources for community development. The establishment of ongoing connections between East Timorese communities in Australia and reconstruction efforts in East Timor created beneficial relationships that provided continuing support for development while enabling Australian East Timorese to maintain cultural connections and contribute to homeland recovery without requiring physical return that might not be appropriate for their individual circumstances. The success of these transnational connections demonstrated how humanitarian work could create lasting relationships that transcended national boundaries while serving both diaspora communities and homeland reconstruction through cultural exchange, resource sharing, and mutual support that benefited all participants while strengthening East Timorese identity and global solidarity. Chapter 5. Building the New Nation. Paul's continued involvement in East Timor's reconstruction evolved from emergency humanitarian response to long-term development partnership as the country achieved formal independence and began the complex process of building democratic institutions, economic systems, and social infrastructure that could serve the needs of citizens while preserving cultural identity and values that had sustained resistance during centuries of occupation and oppression. The transition from humanitarian crisis to development cooperation required Paul to learn new skills in institution building, economic development, and democratic governance while maintaining his focus on authentic relationships and community empowerment that had made his crisis response work effective in serving both immediate needs and long-term objectives of self-determination and prosperity. The challenges of nation building in East Timor included not just physical reconstruction but the creation of government institutions, legal systems, educational facilities, and economic policies that could serve a population that had limited experience with democratic governance but strong traditions of community decision-making and cultural autonomy that needed to be integrated into modern state structures. Paul's role in supporting institutional development required him to serve as cultural interpreter between international advisors who brought technical expertise in governance and economics and East Timorese leaders who possessed deep understanding of their society's needs and values but lacked experience with contemporary administrative and political systems that were necessary for effective independent governance. The establishment of the East Timor Development Institute provided institutional support for long-term capacity building that could continue after international assistance ended, while ensuring that East Timorese knowledge and priorities remained central to development planning and implementation rather than being subordinated to external agendas and assumptions about appropriate development strategies. Dr. Jose Ramos Horta, who would later become East Timor's president, became Paul's key partner in developing approaches to nation building that balanced international standards and requirements with East Timorese cultural values and social structures that were essential for legitimacy and effectiveness of new institutions and policies. Paul understands that real development must be rooted in our own culture and controlled by our own people, Ramos Horta explained during a planning meeting for educational system development. International assistance is valuable when it supports our own efforts rather than replacing them with external solutions that ignore our knowledge and preferences about how we want to organize our society. The development of educational systems that combined international standards with East Timorese language and cultural content required Paul to coordinate between UNESCO specialists, Australian education consultants, and East Timorese teachers and community leaders whose collaboration was essential for creating schools that prepared students for global participation while maintaining cultural identity and knowledge. The success of bicultural education programs demonstrated how development cooperation could strengthen rather than undermine cultural identity when programs were designed to utilize indigenous knowledge and values rather than replacing them with external curricula that ignored local wisdom and community priorities about appropriate education for their children. The economic development programs that Paul helped establish focused on sustainable enterprises that utilized East Timorese resources and skills while generating employment and income that could support families and communities without creating dependency on external markets or investment that might exploit rather than benefit local populations. The success of coffee cooperatives, traditional craft enterprises, and sustainable tourism programs demonstrated how economic development could serve both cultural preservation and poverty reduction when approaches respected community values while building capacity for participation in global markets that offered opportunities for prosperity without compromising essential cultural identity. The establishment of healthcare systems that integrated traditional East Timorese healing practices with contemporary medical science provided more effective and cultural appropriate care while training East Timorese health workers in approaches that served both individual needs and community well-being through holistic understanding of human health and social relationships. Paul's work with health system development required him to coordinate between international medical experts and traditional healers whose knowledge and authority were essential for community acceptance of new healthcare facilities and practices, creating integrated approaches that honored both scientific knowledge and cultural wisdom about healing and wellness. The success of integrated healthcare demonstrated how development cooperation could build on existing cultural resources rather than replacing them with external solutions that ignored local knowledge and authority, creating systems that were more effective because they were culturally appropriate and community-controlled rather than externally imposed. The political development programs that Paul supported focused on strengthening democratic institutions while preserving traditional decision-making processes that were central to East Timorese culture and social organization, creating governance systems that balanced international standards with indigenous values and practices. The constitutional development process that Paul observed provided examples of how democratic governance could be adapted to local cultural values and social structures while meeting international requirements for human rights protection and institutional accountability that were necessary for international recognition and support. The environmental protection programs that integrated traditional ecological knowledge with contemporary conservation science created effective approaches to managing natural resources while generating economic opportunities through sustainable development that served both environmental protection and poverty reduction objectives that benefited entire communities. Chapter 6, The Legacy of Service. The long-term impact of Paul Hogan's humanitarian leadership during the East Timor crisis extended far beyond immediate emergency response to encompass fundamental contributions to nation-building, international cooperation, and the development of new approaches to crisis response that prioritized cultural sensitivity and community empowerment alongside traditional humanitarian objectives of saving lives and providing basic necessities. The East Timor model of culturally responsive humanitarian assistance became internationally recognized as best practice for crisis response in situations where cultural identity and community structure were essential for both immediate survival and long-term recovery, influencing UN policies and training programs for humanitarian workers deployed to complex emergencies worldwide. The Harvard Kennedy School's case study of Paul's leadership during the East Timor crisis became required reading in graduate programs for international development and humanitarian studies, demonstrating how authentic relationship building and cultural humility could achieve results that exceeded those of traditional bureaucratic approaches to emergency response and post-conflict reconstruction. Dr. Samantha Powers, who would later serve as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, cited Paul's work as exemplifying the kind of humanitarian leadership that was needed to address complex emergencies where political, cultural, and economic factors intersected in ways that traditional aid approaches failed to understand or address effectively through their narrow focus on logistics and resource distribution. Paul's approach demonstrates that effective humanitarian work requires more than good intentions and professional expertise, Powers wrote in her analysis of successful crisis interventions. It requires authentic relationships, cultural understanding, and commitment to empowering communities rather than creating dependency on external assistance that undermines local capacity and self-determination. The establishment of the Hogan Institute for Humanitarian Leadership at the Fraser University created permanent institutional support for training crisis response workers in cultural sensitivity and community empowerment approaches that had proven effective in East Timor and similar situations where traditional humanitarian methods had failed to achieve sustainable results. The Institute's training programs attracted participants from international organizations, government agencies, and NGOs whose work in crisis situations required skills in relationship building, cultural interpretation, and community mobilization that were rarely included in conventional humanitarian education but were essential for effective assistance that served both immediate and long-term objectives. The research programs developed by the Institute documented the effectiveness of culturally responsive humanitarian approaches while creating theoretical frameworks and practical methodologies that could inform policy development and program design for organizations seeking to improve their effectiveness in complex emergencies that required cultural understanding and community partnership. Paul's ongoing relationship with East Timor included regular visits to observe and support the country's continued development while maintaining friendships and professional relationships with leaders whose collaboration had been essential for successful crisis response and nation-building efforts that created stable and prosperous communities. The 20th anniversary celebration of East Timor's independence provided opportunities for Paul to reflect on the long-term outcomes of the humanitarian mission that had transformed his life while contributing to the successful birth of a nation that had overcome centuries of oppression and occupation through the resilience and determination of its people. The most important thing I learned in East Timor was that humanitarian work is not about saving people, but about supporting their own efforts to save themselves and build the kind of society they want for their children. Paul reflected during anniversary interviews with international media covering the celebration of successful independence and development. The continued success of programs and institutions that Paul had helped establish demonstrated the sustainability of development approaches that built on local knowledge and capacity while utilizing international resources and expertise, creating models that continued producing positive results long after external assistance ended and full local control was established. The East Timorese government's invitation for Paul to serve as honorary cultural ambassador recognized his continuing contributions to the country while providing official status for his ongoing work in promoting international understanding and support for East Timor's development priorities and cultural preservation efforts. The international recognition of Paul's humanitarian leadership included awards from the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and various governments and organizations whose work had been influenced by his approaches to crisis response and community empowerment that demonstrated the effectiveness of authentic relationship building in complex emergency situations. The documentary film about Paul's East Timor work, produced by an international team that included both Australian and East Timorese filmmakers, provided educational resources for training humanitarian workers while honoring the contributions of East Timorese leaders and communities whose collaboration had been essential for successful crisis response and reconstruction efforts. The film's international distribution created broader awareness of culturally responsive humanitarian approaches while generating funding for continuing development programs in East Timor and similar situations where communities were struggling to rebuild after conflict, natural disasters, or other emergencies that required both immediate assistance and long-term commitment to sustainable development. The master's degree program in humanitarian leadership that Paul developed in partnership with several universities created formal educational pathways for professionals seeking to develop skills in crisis response and community development that integrated technical expertise with cultural understanding and authentic relationship building that were essential for effective service in complex emergencies. Epilogue: The Bridge Between Crisis and Hope. 25 years after the East Timor crisis first called Paul Hogan to humanitarian service, his transformation from Australian entertainer to international crisis leader stands as testament to the extraordinary impact that authentic leadership and genuine service can achieve when channeled toward purposes that transcend individual success while creating sustainable positive change that continues benefiting communities long after immediate emergencies end. The Paul Hogan Center for Crisis Leadership at the United Nations has become the global standard for training humanitarian workers in culturally responsive emergency response, with programs operating in over 40 countries where complex emergencies require skills in relationship building, cultural interpretation, and community empowerment that traditional aid approaches had failed to develop or utilize effectively. The center's current director, Dr. Maria Soares Chen, the same refugee mother who had inspired Paul's understanding of dignity and cultural preservation during the Darwin emergency response, now oversees training programs that prepare thousands of humanitarian workers annually while maintaining the core principles of authentic relationship building and community empowerment that guided the original East Timor intervention. Paul taught me that crisis can be opportunity if we approach it with the right spirit and commitment to serving others rather than advancing ourselves, Soares Chen reflected during the center's 25th anniversary celebration attended by humanitarian leaders from around the world. That lesson has guided my entire career and continues informing our approach to preparing crisis workers who understand that their role is to support communities rather than save them. The East Timor success story continues inspiring humanitarian workers and development professionals worldwide, as the country has achieved remarkable progress in building democratic institutions, reducing poverty, and preserving cultural identity while participating actively in international cooperation and regional development that benefits neighboring countries and global stability. The economic and social indicators documenting East Timor's progress since independence demonstrate the effectiveness of development approaches that build on cultural strengths and community capacity while utilizing international resources and expertise, creating models that have been adapted for post-conflict reconstruction in dozens of other countries facing similar challenges. The educational exchanges that continue connecting East Timor's students with Australian universities while bringing international students to East Timor create ongoing opportunities for cultural learning and professional development that benefit all participants while strengthening international relationships and mutual understanding that support continued peace and prosperity. The business enterprises established through reconstruction programs continue providing employment and economic opportunities while maintaining their commitment to cultural preservation and community development, demonstrating that sustainable development and cultural identity can be mutually reinforcing when approached with appropriate understanding and respect for community values. The healthcare and educational systems that integrated traditional knowledge with contemporary science continue serving as models for culturally responsive service delivery that achieves better outcomes while respecting community values and authority, influencing policy development in international development organizations and government agencies worldwide. Paul's continued involvement in humanitarian work includes mentoring emerging crisis leaders while serving on advisory committees for international organizations seeking to improve their effectiveness in complex emergencies that require cultural understanding and community partnership rather than traditional top-down assistance approaches that often fail to achieve sustainable results. The most important lesson from East Timor is that every crisis contains the seeds of transformation if we approach it with authentic commitment to serving others and building relationships that honor human dignity and cultural wisdom. Paul reflected during a recent interview about his humanitarian career and its continuing influence on international emergency response. The next generation of humanitarian leaders includes participants from every continent who learned Paul's approaches through training programs, field experience, and mentorship relationships that continue expanding the reach and effectiveness of culturally responsive crisis leadership that serves both immediate needs and long-term objectives of community empowerment and sustainable development. The global network for humanitarian innovation continues growing through connections between practitioners who share commitment to authentic relationship building and community empowerment while adapting these approaches to different cultural contexts and emergency situations that require local knowledge and cultural sensitivity for effective assistance. The research programs documenting the effectiveness of culturally responsive humanitarian approaches continue producing evidence that informs policy development and program design while training new generations of researchers who understand that effective crisis response requires both technical expertise and cultural competence that can only be developed through authentic relationships and genuine commitment to service. The Paul Hogan Foundation for Crisis Leadership continues providing scholarships and training opportunities for humanitarian workers from developing countries whose participation in international emergency response brings essential cultural knowledge and community relationships that improve assistance effectiveness while building global capacity for culturally responsive crisis leadership. Paul's ultimate legacy lies not in the specific programs or institutions that bear his name, but in the fundamental demonstration that authentic leadership based on genuine service can transform both individual lives and entire societies while creating approaches to crisis response that honor human dignity and cultural wisdom alongside technical expertise and organizational efficiency. The crisis leader who discovered his calling in humanity's darkest moments proved that authentic service can build bridges between despair and hope, creating pathways to recovery and development that continue serving communities long after immediate emergencies end while inspiring others to discover their own capacity for transformative service in times of greatest need. The bridge between crisis and hope continues strengthening through the dedicated efforts of thousands of humanitarian workers who learned from Paul's example that individual commitment to authentic service can create ripple effects of positive change that transform emergency response while building more compassionate and effective approaches to supporting human dignity and community resilience in our interconnected but often divided world.